What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are starting Marvel's new Spider-Man-centric event, which is called Dark Web. And honestly, it's really more of like a Spider-Man X-Men crossover that also associates with Venom. As the story unfolds, we'll figure out more who is all involved in this. But while we will be covering the story, we also kind of have to explain things along the way. And the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to talk about Ben Reilly. So Ben Reilly, leading up to this story, you actually had Amazing Spider-Man. The big takeaway from all of this is that Ben Reilly had seemingly just reappeared in Peter Parker's life. And this made sense, right? Because Ben Reilly really became a major character back in the day in Marvel Comics as part of the original Clone Saga and then the reworked Clone Saga in the 1990s, that he was effectively a clone of Peter Parker that was created when Marvel was trying to replace Peter as Spider-Man and introduce somebody else, and it was a great big huge nightmare. But Ben Reilly has just kind of disappeared and reappeared from Marvel Comics over the years. Sometimes his reappearances are important, sometimes they're not. During the more recent arc, what we ended up finding out is that following the collapse of Parker Industries, that a company called Beyond Corporation ended up buying all the different assets that belonged to Parker Industries, one of which was the name and likeness of Spider-Man, which had been copyrighted by Peter Parker, or at least copyrighted by Parker Industries, in order to ensure that there couldn't be anybody out there operating as Spider-Man in addition to Peter. But because Peter never solidified the copyrights for himself, meaning he never took them or brought them under his own name from Parker Industries, when Beyond Corporation bought Parker Industries, they got the rights along with it. And so what they did is they basically had Ben Reilly become the new Spider-Man and literally issued a cease and desist to Peter Parker. Now, some of the things that were also going on behind the scenes is we saw the return of Janine. Janine was a character who rose to prominence in the 1990s in Marvel Comics as what was basically supposed to be Ben Reilly's version of Mary Jane Watson. Didn't really last too long, and by the mid-1990s, Marvel had basically written her out. When she had come back here, it was after serving a prison sentence for having previously murdered her dad, and of course was brought in to kind of be Ben Reilly's love interest and the person that would sort of keep him on the moral track, such as it was, given her own background. But the other part of this is that Ben Reilly operating under Beyond Corporation, the relationship between the two was really almost identical to the relationship between Hydra and Bucky Barnes from like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in the sense that Beyond Corporation was basically bankrolling Ben Reilly's efforts, that they were financing everything he did. They gave him the suit, the whole 9 yards. But what they would do is they would selectively remove memories from Ben Reilly's own mind in order to keep him under their control. Eventually, Ben Reilly learned about everything. Beyond Corporation scrubbed the whole project and then just disappeared. And so what Ben Reilly had been doing leading up to this Amazing Spider-Man number 13 story is he had actually been going after these different safe houses that belonged to Beyond Corporation in order to take pot shots at the company, which was now operating underground, but also to secure different pieces of equipment for his own goal. And the reason for that is because Ben Reilly has had this kind of lingering feeling in his mind that he's being tugged somewhere. He doesn't entirely know what that place is, but he knows that constructing a portal is necessary in order for him to get there. And so what takes place here is that Janine actually ends up traveling to Grand Central to kind of regain her bearings because she's not entirely sure how she feels about Ben Reilly constructing a portal that just sort of leads to somewhere. No idea where it's going to take him, right? Maybe take him to the realm of the Cenobites. But as she's there, she ends up meeting with the guy who runs the restaurant. And the two of them are just kind of casually talking. Of course, he knows her identity as Janine Godby. He recognizes her because, of course, Beyond Corporation have kind of dumped the information out into the world. But one of the things that happens is a waitress comes up to the chef and tells him that the dishwasher is on their way there. He's just running a little bit late. And that's when she realizes this is a very, very poorly concocted effort by the waitress to alert this guy that the cops are on their way. Janine picks up on it pretty fast, literally stabs the guy in the hand with a fork and then flees for her life. And when that happens, she gets back to Ben Reilly and basically joins his cause. Now, the reason why this matters, and it's really an attempt to sort of build up the character of Janine. Back in the 1990s, when she was introduced and we learned her backstory, that she was abused by her dad and ended up killing him because of his actions, this is how her and Ben Reilly bonded. That Ben Reilly was in a lot of ways a cast-off. The fact that they both felt like they had no place in the world is what unified them and brought them together. And that ultimately led to Ben Reilly and Janine forming a romantic interest, and then again becoming a kind of Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson type situation. Now, of course, when everything was wrapped up and her character came to an end and disappeared, as she's reappearing here, it's reinvigorating that idea that there's no place for her in the world. Because during her time when she had, or really when Ben Reilly was operating as Spider-Man and she was his love interest, it was the closest the two of them had ever gotten to living that Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson fantasy life, because it was the life they always wanted for themselves. But once that was stripped away from them, they were sort of cast back down, so to speak, to the life they were trying to escape from. And now they're kind of forging their own path, with Janine saying, you, Ben Reilly, feel like there's no place for you in the world. Your memories and your identities have basically been stripped from you. I lost my life when I was thrown in prison and that kind of thing, so let's just live that life together. Of course, she agrees to aid him in his efforts, and that's when he redons the costume of Chasm. Now, that's the other part of what was going on with Ben Reilly, that during the original Spider-Man story, or really during the more recent Spider-Man story, that in the first encountering, or the first outing, when Ben Reilly went out and did his thing, he faced off against the UFOs, Peter Parker intervened. Peter Parker ultimately succumbed to the effects of their abilities, which was essentially radiation sickness. Now, this led to like Aunt May hitting up Dr. Octopus, because at one time they were going to get married in the comics. They've had a lengthy, not really relationship, but they're aware of each other, that she ended up hitting him up, that he basically helped to cure Peter, learned what was going on with the Beyond Corporation and Ben Reilly, and threatened to expose all their actions. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into it that is not overly important in relation to this. The long and short is that the end of the story basically saw Peter Parker fighting Ben Reilly, and then Ben Reilly was believed to have been dead. He was ultimately discovered by Janine, but because so much of his life had been taken away, meaning that he couldn't be Spider-Man anymore, right? A lot of his memories were gone. He started calling himself Chasm, because that's basically how he felt on the inside. It's sort of an on-the-nose name, but it works for what it is. But with Chasm and Janine, or really Ben Reilly and Janine, going forward and doing their own thing, they're ultimately able to construct this portal. And when the portal is opened and Ben Reilly passes through, Ben Reilly passes into Limbo, where he meets Madeline Pryor. Now, here's the thing. We need to explain this, because I feel like a lot of people who are picking up Marvel Comics recently are not overly familiar with Madeline Pryor. Unless you've been reading New Mutants recently, or unless you've been reading the X-Men, Madeline Pryor is a character that is unfamiliar to you. So let's wind the clock back in Marvel Comics to like the 1970s. Let's go all the way back to the 1970s, right? Let's go to the aftermath of the Dark Phoenix saga when Jean Grey dies. There's a villain in Marvel Comics named Mr. Sinister, who most all of you are aware of. And Mr. Sinister had realized that if Jean Grey and Cyclops ever had a child together, their child would be godly powerful. The problem is he couldn't really abscond with Jean Grey and then force her to initiate a coupling with Cyclops, because they would resist. Plus, you know, it's a pretty dark level of storytelling considering what Marvel was doing at the time. And so what ended up happening here is that in an effort to produce a child between Cyclops and Jean, which was really more based on their actual genealogy as opposed to their powers, he cloned Jean Grey, and that's where you got Madeline Pryor. Now, Madeline Pryor showed up to basically meet with Cyclops when he was in Anchorage, Alaska, just kind of living his own life and leaving the X-Men after Jean Grey died. And where the story depicted itself as Cyclops sort of knowing that it wasn't really Jean, he leaned into the idea that it could be Jean. And so really just kind of lied to himself, right? He just tricked himself. And ultimately, he and Madeline ended up having a child named Nathan Summers, who, by a different set of events, was whisked off to the future and ultimately became Cable. But literally, when Cyclops learns that Jean Grey's alive, that she effectively returned after her supposed death, which we're not going to get into how that happened, Cyclops basically bailed on Madeline Pryor. He literally abandoned his wife and went back to Jean. It was kind of a big to-do in Marvel Comics at the time. Like, damn, like a superhero just abandoning his wife and his child? Like, that's kind of a dick move, Chris Claremont. And of course, that initiated the launch of the X-Factor comics in Marvel. But the thing about this is Madeline Pryor had always held on to that grudge, because she saw herself much in the same way that Ben Reilly saw himself as becoming Peter, and Janine saw herself as becoming Mary Jane, that Madeline always saw herself as the rightful love interest of Cyclops and always pursued the life that Jean Grey wanted. This led into a great big huge story called Inferno, where literally Madeline Pryor makes a deal with demons and invades the city of New York. It was a cool story. But Madeline Pryor, of course, has basically been dead in Marvel Comics, or had been dead in Marvel Comics for a little while, until Jonathan Hickman launched his X-Men run. Madeline Pryor was one of the mutants who was brought back, but the rules in Krakoa is you can't have a clone of an existing member of Krakoa in the mutant island of Krakoa itself. And so where this led to the rejection of the fact that Madeline Pryor could be brought back after her death, what ended up happening is she was secretly returned, but because the rules of Krakoa say mutants cannot kill mutants and they cannot kill humans, that everybody there was kind of forced to give Madeline Pryor her own own domain, removed from being a threat to anybody else. So she was literally cast away back to the realm of Limbo, where she's been residing ever since. And that's why when Ben Reilly passes through here, Madeline Pryor is there waiting for him. And it's a really interesting thing because Madeline Pryor, she's had significant roles in Marvel Comics. It wasn't even just Inferno, right? Like she manipulated the original X-Man, Nate Gray, right? The Age of Apocalypse version of Cable. Everything that Cable could become if he didn't have the techno-organic virus bonded to his body and constantly had to keep the virus from eating him alive. X-Man Nate Gray was stupidly overpowered. This guy was next level in terms of his capabilities. But what's important here is that with the two of them meeting, the reality is they find common ground. And the reason why, and it's a little ambiguous here, that Madeline Pryor says that Limbo always tugs to people who feel cast out in some capacity. Now that kind of ties into like the old school magic stories, right, with Ilyana Rasputin, which really dealt with the introduction of like the demonic Limbo in Marvel for the first time. The idea that she was locked away there and then basically learned how to use powers while she was there. But the reality here is Madeline Pryor kind of hitting at this idea that the realm of Limbo always tugs to those who feel cast out, who feel like they have no place. That's the reason why Ben Reilly felt the desire to come here. It's the reason why he was sort of pulled in this direction. And so what ends up happening is Ben Reilly and Madeline Pryor actually end up making an agreement with each other. They end up making a deal with each other that Ben Reilly wants the life that he feels belongs to him, the life of Peter Parker and the memories of Peter Parker, all of which have been taken from him. Those were memories that he had when he was cloned initially and believed that he was the actual Peter Parker. That was the entire foundation and the basis behind the original Clone Saga. But Madeline Pryor also feels like the life that Jean Grey has is the life that she should have. So both of them are really pursuing the lives of different people who live on Earth. And so what you end up having is this conversation that takes place between Ben Reilly and Janine and Madeline Pryor when Ben Reilly brings Janine to the realm of Limbo. Janine feels a little off about it all, right? She feels a little strange about it all. Like, I mean, I kind of get where you guys are coming from, but I feel a little weird about the fact that my man has whisked off to a demonic realm and is kind of finding common ground with like this red-haired chick that looks like Kerrigan from StarCraft, but like she feels a little weird about it. But the funny thing is that Madeline Pryor meets directly with Janine and it kind of has this conversation and saying, you're not that dissimilar from us. Like she literally says, like me, you despise it, being at the mercy of forces beyond your control. You would rather shape your own destiny than play the perpetual victim. And so what ends up happening is Madeline Pryor presents her with basically an object, an artifact, and says, if you choose to accept this, then you can literally reshape your destiny. You can make your life what you want it to be because it will grant you power. And so initially she rejects it, but then agrees that she's tired of sitting on the sidelines and watching like Ben Reilly do stuff. She's tired of sitting on the sidelines and feeling like she's in the passenger seat of her own life. And so this artifact is literally placed into Janine. And when that happens, Madeline sees control of her, casts a spell, and then turns her into somebody who has probably one of the most ridiculous names ever, which is called Hallows Eve. I don't mean to be like to beat down. The overall story is cool, but come on, man. Like, can we not think of better names than Hallows Eve? Come up with a better name. It's just too on the nose. And so in an effort to basically demonstrate to Ben Reilly that the words of Madeline Pryor are true, and she can actually give him what it is that he wants, what she does is she sends him back to Earth in order to gather or to grab a person that can allow her to cast a spell to demonstrate what she's capable of. And so Ben Reilly travels back to the city of New York and ends up meeting with a guy named Gus. Now, Gus had previously hounded Ben Reilly, believing Ben was Peter Parker, over debts that were owed by Peter. And so when Ben Reilly gets back here, he kind of allows Gus to play the game a little bit and saying like, I know you're Peter, I've talked to everybody that you know, and like you owe us money, Peter, like you need to pay up and we're gonna go after people and so on and so forth, but trying to strong arm Ben Reilly. And so much to the enjoyment of anybody who has encountered a debt collector, Ben Reilly whisks this guy off to a demonic realm. Literally overcomes this guy and he's like, you know what, debt collector, we're gonna do what everybody wants to do to you, which is take you to hell. And so this literally leads to this debt collector being brought to Madeline Pryor. This guy's terrified out of his mind, but she feeds him from a tree that's called the Tree of Exquisite Knowledge. It immediately kills him, but it's not him dying that's important here. What is important is that by consuming the fruit, what it does is it allows Madeline Pryor to extract this guy's soul from his body. And when that happens, it allows her to know everything he knew. And that's when she's actually honestly, like, I mean, okay, was the guy a debt collector? Yeah. And should Peter Parker have paid his debts? Sure. Otherwise this guy wouldn't have been hounding him. But in reality, he was a terrible person and did some incredibly terrible things. And in fact, he was basically a serial killer. And so the result of this is it demonstrates to Ben Reilly, if we can get Peter Parker to consume part of this tree, we can basically extract the soul from his body, you consume it, and you replace Peter Parker. For her, it's the same thing. She can extract the soul of Jean Grey and know everything that Jean Grey knows and literally take over her life. And so that's literally the campaign of the two of them going forward. Now, truth to tell, I'm not current with Dark Web. I haven't read any of the stories that are going on with it yet. I don't know if it's cool or I don't know if it's trash. We'll find out because we're gonna cover it. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.